What's up, guys? I got two items of material here today. One is this single sheet. Now, we know that there are certain numbers that, like, in math, are certain symbols that represent numbers. For example, like pi is equal to 3.14. Now, you're going to learn about a new one today. It's called I to the second power. I to the second power equals -1. Okay? That's just a fact. I to the second power equals -1. Now, I want you to evaluate these following exponents for I. You're like, well, how do you do that? Well, it's actually pretty easy. Split that into a group of I to the second. So I to the second and another I to the second would make I to the fourth and then I to the sixth. Okay? Now, I to the second equals -1, so all these are -1 values. They're replaced with -1, and then -1 times -1 times -1 is -1. Now, I to the eighth. Okay, so that's -1, -1, -1, -1. Now up here there was an odd number of negative factors. That results in a negative product. Here there's an even number of negative factors, so that results in a positive product, +1. Okay. I to the 10th. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, so -1, -1, -1 times -1 times -1. Well, the product's 1, but there's an odd number of negatives now, so it'd be -1. Okay, pause the video and do this problem here. Find what I to the 12th equals. Okay, hopefully you got that. Now, next part. Square root of negative numbers. Now, you might think on the board and say, oh, that's 6. No, 6 times 6 is 36, not -36. You might look on the board, okay, so if it's -36, how about -6? No, that's still positive. -6 times itself is still +36. Okay, now, this is what I is used for. It allows us to find negative square roots, okay? So what you do if you have a negative inside of a square root, a radical, you make it positive and you bring an I out. Okay, not I to the second, just I. And then you look up on the board and you see 36. The square root of 36 is 6. Okay, so 6I though. Okay. Now you're like, how is the square root of -36 6I? Well, here's why. Because if I take 6I times 6I, that's 36I to the second, but I to the second holds that special value of -1. So this is really 36 times -1, and that's -36, okay? So, square root of -36 is 6I. Okay, now the next one, and I'm going to write my perfect squares down here, okay? So, 1 times 1 is 1, not really, you don't really use that. 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 times 5 is 25, 6 times 6 is 36, 7 times 7 is 49, 8 times 8 is 64, 9 times 9 is 81. I'm just writing them down because I don't have my board at home. Okay, and that's about as far as we need to go. Okay. Now the square root of -5. So we're going to what we need to do if we have a negative, we make it positive. Okay. Now 5 is not a perfect square. Okay. So I look at all these numbers here. Okay, on the board, and 5 is not one of them. Okay, so I divide into 5. Okay, so 4 is the first number we can maybe divide 5 by, but it's a decimal. And then 1, don't bother dividing by 1. So if you can't find anything other than 1 to divide by, this is your answer right here with the I square root 5. Write it here so it looks nicer. Okay. All right, next one, make it positive, bring your I out. Okay. So 18 is not a perfect square because there's no number times itself, no rational number times itself that's 18. So I divide. So 18 divided by 16 decimal. 18 divided by 9, that works, okay? So I set up a product of two square roots and I put 9 and 2. So 9 becomes 3, so you're like, oh, that's 3 square root 2. Yeah, but where's the I go? The I needs to go between the whole number and the square root. That's how that's written. So 3I square root 2. Next one. Now again, here's why that's 18. You can just watch it, okay? So I'm going to take 3I, yeah, never mind, okay? Then make it positive, bring the I out. So 12 divided by 9 is a decimal. 12 divided by 4, okay, is 3. So I rewrite this as a product of two square roots, and I put 4 and 3. Two separate square roots, a product, and the square root of 4 is 2. So it'd be 2 square root of 3, and I goes in there. 2I square root 3. Okay, square root of negative 26, so bring the I out, okay? Now you can think in terms of positive. So 26 divided by 25 is a decimal. 26 divided by 16 is a decimal. 26 divided by 9 is a decimal. Divided by 4 is a decimal. And then you come to 1, so when you come to 1, that means that's done, okay? So that's your answer. Write it so it looks nicer, though, without the plus in there, okay? Okay, square root of negative 32, bring out your I, okay? Whenever you end up with that negative, so then you can think in terms of positive 32. So I divide 32, what would that be divisible by? So 25, no. 16, yes, okay. So I rewrite that as a product of two square roots with 16 times 2. So it's 4, so 4 square root of 2. Remember to put the I in between the number and the whole number and the square root number. Okay, square root of negative 48, so bring out I. So 48, okay. 48 divided by 36, okay. 25, 16, cha-ching, okay. So I rewrite it as a product of two square roots and then 16 and 3. We've kind of done this before, you just got to bring the I, have the I now, okay. So square root of 16 is 4. So it's 4 square root 3, put the I right there. Now, I'm going to explain how that became negative 48, okay? You don't need to write this down, just observe. If I take 4I square root of 3 times 4I square root of 3, this is going to end up back to negative 48. And here's how. 4 times 4 is 16. Then I multiply my i's, that'd be I to the second. And then I make a square root, and then 3 times 3 would give me 9. So I'd have 16. I squared is negative 1, and the square root of 9 is 3, and that all multiplies to negative 48. So that's how that works. Okay, the square root of negative 144. Okay, now don't divide because, yeah, you bring the I out, but 144 is a perfect square. Okay, so square root goes away, and it's just 12. Not a square root over it, though. Okay, it's just 12I. So when it's actually a perfect square, we just put what the square root is, the whole number value, with an I in front. With an I behind it, excuse me. I always goes in front of square roots and then behind whole numbers. Okay, now we're going to do some operations involving I, okay? First ones are pretty easy. First off, you got a quantity, 5 plus 2i and 8 minus 1i, okay? That's a negative 1i. Now, with a plus, it's very easy, okay? You go blank plus blank I, that's how that needs to be written. So what are your constants? You have 5 and 8. You add those, that's 13. And then what are your I coefficients? 2 and -1. So add those, that's 1. Okay, next problem. Blank plus blank I. So what are your constants? And you have the plus, so that's why you go straight there. -4 plus 8 is going to be 4. And then the i's 10 and -7 makes 3. So 4 plus 3i. Now with a minus it's the same thing, but you're going to put a 1 in front of that. With a minus it's the same thing, but you need to rewrite this as a plus. So plus, and then what happens is everything in the second parentheses turns into the opposite. So -2 and +1. Okay, everything, not just the number after it, but everything in that second quantity, that second parentheses. Blank plus blank I. Okay, so 12 and -2 adds to 10. 5 and 1 adds to 6. 10 plus 6i. Now, game changer here. There's no sign between the parentheses. That means it's multiplication. Now, with multiplication, that's a totally different ballgame than when there's an addition or subtraction sign. Okay, multiplication. You have to count how many terms you have in each quantity. That's 1 and 2, 8 and 2. So that's 2 terms. That's 2 terms, 2 separate terms there, the 4 and the -3i, so that's 2. So 2 by 2 is the FOIL method, okay? So 8 times 4, 8 times -3i, then I take 2i times 4, and then back to 2i times -3i. Now find these products, but then something's going to happen that hasn't happened before. Like it's different than when you're doing x's or any other variable. Okay, so that's 32, -24i, 8i, and -6i to the second. But I to the second is equal to -1. So that means this I squared is replaced with -1. So it's -6 times -1. That ends up being 6. So these are my products, it's my individual products I have. Now with the whole product, you go blank plus blank I. So constants, you have a 32 and a 6. 6 now joins the 32 as a constant, and that would be 38. And the i's -24 and 8 would be -16. Okay, next one. That's a times. So the operation's multiplying. So count the terms you have in each quantity. You have 2 terms and 2 terms. That's another FOIL method. Okay. So 8 times 2. 8 times 3i. Again, I is different than any other variable. Okay. -6i times 2, and -6i times 3i. Okay, so 16, 24i, -12i, and -18i to the second. But remember, when dealing with I to the second equals -1. So you replace the I to the second with -1 and times. So that's +18. So you got 16 and 18, and then 24 and -12. So blank plus blank I. So the constants, you have 18 joining the 16, which gives us 34. 24 and -12 add up to 12. Okay. Now with the second power, all that means you do is make a times and then copy what you have in the first quantity. Okay. But this is not a FOIL, because this is just one term, this is just one term. So 1 by 1 means I just find one product. 2 by 2 is the FOIL, 1 by 1 is just one single product. Okay, since 1 times 1 is 1, there's just one product we have to find. -16i to the second, but we know that I to the second equals -1. Okay, so it's -16 times -1, and that's 16. So 16 is the only term you got, okay? I messed this up. Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. I'm sorry, I messed that up. Okay, so it's positive 16 by times negative 1, which is negative 16. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, 12i quantity squared, so we duplicate that out and take 12i times 12a. That's one term. That's one term. You should label how many terms you have when you're multiplying. Okay, so you know how many products you have to find. 1 times 1 is 1, so that's one product. Okay, 2 by 2, there's 4 products to find, but 1 by 1, there's just 1. So that'd be 144 I to the second. Okay, but again, I to the second equals negative 1. So it's 144 times negative 1, which is negative 144. Okay, 3 plus 4i when you have a whole quantity squared, that means you just duplicate the quantity with a multiplication. Now, how many terms is that? As 2 terms, 3 and 4i, that is 2 separate terms, so we're back to a FOIL. Okay, so 3 times 3, 3 times 4i, 4i times 3, and 4i times 4i. So that equals a product of 9. That's a product of 12i. That's a product of 12i. And that's a product of 16i to the second. But remember the rule, I to the second equals negative 1. I doesn't equal negative 1, but I to the second does. So this ends up being 16 times negative 1, which is negative 16. So these are your 4 products. Those first 3 are done, but this was negative 16. So now these 2 are like terms. We can put those together. So for constants, we have 9 and negative 16. That adds to negative 7. 12 plus 12 is 24. Okay, 8 plus 2i quantity squared. So again, with the quantity squared, you just duplicate the parentheses. So with multiplication, that has 2, that has 2. So 2 by 2 is the FOIL method. So 8 times 8, 8 times 2i, 2i times 8, and then 2i times 2i. Okay, so that would equal 64, and then 16i, and then 16i again. Then that would be 4i to the second. Remember, I to the second holds a special numerical value of negative 1. So then I replace I to the second with negative 1. That's negative 4. Okay. So these are my 4 products. We just have to combine like terms. Blank plus blank I. So constant 64 plus negative 4 is 60. And then 16 plus 16 is 32. Okay. Now, done on the assignment. Now remember here, you're just simplifying the square roots with the i's. Okay, use the board. Remember, this one here, the square root, you bring I out, but the square root of 4 is 2 whole. So 2i would be the answer. Then remember, if you can't divide it by anything other than 1, you just leave it with the I outside, positive. Okay. Okay, and then when you get to simplifying expressions, if you have pluses and minuses, you're good. You just line up your spaces. Remember the minuses to reverse it, okay? Then with the times, that's going to be a FOIL. 2 by 2, that's a FOIL. You'll make a duplicate parentheses, but that's just going to be a 1 by 1. So just one product will be your answer. That's it.